The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across Valentine, Nebraska, as Margaret Zimmerman clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders. The bitter wind of October 1875 cut through her thin dress, but it was the burning shame and desperation that truly chilled her to the bone. Just hours ago, she had been a wife. Now, she was little more than property traded for a bottle of whiskey. Margaret's tears had dried, leaving salt tracks on her dirt-smudged face. 3 years of marriage to Frank Phillips had ended in the filthy back room of the Rusty Nail Saloon. Her husband had gambled away their last dollars, drunk himself into a stupor, and when the barkeep demanded payment, Frank had looked at her with dead eyes and slurred, "Take the woman. She's worth at least a bottle of your finest." She hadn't believed it at first. Not until Frank stumbled out, clutching his precious whiskey, and the barkeep had grabbed her arm and told her she now worked for him. Margaret had fled into the night, running blindly through the muddy streets of Valentine, until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. Now, huddled behind the livery stable, she wondered where she would sleep tonight. Her home, their home, wasn't an option. Frank would be there, and if she returned, she feared what might happen next time he needed a drink. "Madam, you all right back there?" the voice startled her. Margaret scrambled to her feet, ready to run again, when a tall figure emerged from the shadows. The man wore a weather-beaten hat and a long duster, the silver star on his chest catching what little light remained in the day. "Sheriff Ethan Adams," he introduced himself, tipping his hat. "Can't say it's common to find ladies hiding behind stables after sundown." Margaret tried to compose herself, smoothing her skirts, though it did nothing for their sorry state. "I'm fine, Sheriff, just taking a moment to catch my breath." The sheriff's weathered face creased with concern. "Might be none of my business, but you don't look fine to my eye." He stepped closer, and in the dim light, Margaret could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with kind eyes that stood in stark contrast to his rugged appearance. "My husband." She began, then faltered. The humiliation was too much to bear, telling a stranger how little she was worth to the man who'd vowed to cherish her. "Frank Phillips?" the sheriff asked, surprising her. At her nod, he sighed. "Been causing trouble at the Rusty Nail again, has he?" "He sold me," Margaret blurted out, the words tumbling forth before she could stop them. "My husband sold me for whiskey," she cried, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Sheriff Adams went still. For a moment he said nothing, his jaw tightening visibly. "You're worth more than gold, madam," he finally said, his voice low and fierce. "No man has the right to sell another, not in this country, not anymore." Margaret looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. Something in his eyes, compassion, anger, determination, made her believe him, even if only for a moment. "Come on," he said, extending a hand. "Let's get you somewhere warm for the night, then tomorrow we'll sort this matter out proper." Margaret hesitated, then placed her trembling hand in his. As they walked through the darkening streets, she couldn't help but wonder what sorting out would mean for a woman with no money, no family, and a husband who valued her less than a bottle of cheap liquor. Sheriff Adams led her to a modest building with a sign that read, "Valentine Hotel." Inside, the lobby was warmly lit with faded but clean furniture. A matronly woman looked up from behind the desk. "Evening, Mrs. Holbrook," the sheriff said. "Got a lady here in need of a room for the night. Put it on my account, Mrs." Holbrook's eyes traveled from the sheriff to Margaret, taking in her disheveled appearance with a raised eyebrow but mercifully no comment. "Room 3 is available," she said, reaching for a key. "Up the stairs, first door on your right." "Thank you," Margaret whispered. Once upstairs, Sheriff Adams stopped at the door. "Get some rest, Mrs. Phillips. I'll return in the morning. There's a washroom at the end of the hall, and I'll have Mrs. Holbrook bring up some tea and something to eat." "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. The sheriff looked at her for a long moment. "Because it's my job to uphold the law and protect the people of this town, and because no one deserves to be treated as less than human." He tipped his hat again. "Good night, madam." After he left, Margaret sank onto the bed. overwhelmed by the simple kindness she'd been shown something that had been absent from her life for too long. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to weep freely, the tears washing away some of the shame and fear that had built up over 3 years of a marriage that had started with hope but descended into misery. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through thin curtains. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back: Frank's final betrayal, her desperate flight, Sheriff Adams' unexpected kindness. A gentle knock at the door made her start. She hastily smoothed her hair and straightened her rumpled dress before opening it. Mrs. Holbrook stood there, holding a tray with steaming coffee and a plate of eggs and toast. "Breakfast, dear. Sheriff Adams asked me to bring it up, also." She gestured to a bundle of fabric draped over her arm. "My daughter left some dresses when she moved to Omaha last year. You look about her size." Margaret accepted both offerings with murmured thanks, touched by the consideration. After eating and washing up, she changed into one of the dresses, a simple blue calico that was still far nicer than anything she'd worn in months. Frank had sold most of her good clothes to pay gambling debts. Another knock came just as she was pinning up her hair. Sheriff Adams stood in the hallway, hat in hand. "Morning, Mrs. Phillips. Hope you slept well." "Better than I expected to," she admitted. "And please call me Margaret," he nodded. "Margaret, then. I'm Ethan. I've been asking around this morning. Thought you might want to know where things stand." She gestured for him to enter, and they sat in the 2 small chairs by the window. "Frank's gone," Ethan said without preamble. "Left town on the early freight wagon to Sioux City, took what little he had and disappeared." Margaret wasn't surprised. It was Frank's way: create chaos, then vanish before facing consequences. As for the barkeep at the Rusty Nail, Joe Danner, I've had words with him. He claims Frank was so drunk he didn't take the sale seriously, just thought he was getting free whiskey. But I made it clear that treating any person as property in my town will not be tolerated. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, "but I'm not sure what happens now. I have nowhere to go. Our house belongs to the bank. Frank never made the payments he claimed to. I have no family closer than Pennsylvania." Ethan leaned forward. "There's a position open at the school. The teacher's assistant left when she married last month. It's not much pay, but it comes with a room at the boarding house. Miss Thompson, the school teacher, is a good woman. She'd train you." Hope fluttered in Margaret's chest. Before marrying Frank, she'd worked as a shop girl in Chicago and had a decent education. "Do you think she'd consider me? I don't have experience with teaching." "Can you read and cipher, have patience with children?" At her nod, Ethan smiled. "That's more than half the battle. I'll take you to meet her after lunch." Margaret studied his face, still not entirely trusting this stroke of fortune. "Why are you going to such lengths to help me?" Ethan's smile faded, replaced by a solemnity that transformed his face. "6 years ago, my sister found herself in a situation not unlike yours. Her husband was a mean drunk who used his fists freely. She ran, but had nowhere to go. By the time I found out, it was too late." He looked away, jaw tight. "No one helped her when she needed it most. I won't make that same mistake with anyone else." Margaret's heart ached for him and for the sister he couldn't save. She reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry about your sister," he nodded, briefly covering her hand with his other one before standing. "I'll come back at noon. Until then, you're welcome to rest here or walk about town if you'd like. Valentine's not much, but it's peaceful enough." After Ethan left, Margaret sat by the window, watching the town come to life. Wagons rumbled down the main street, shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, and children ran laughing toward the schoolhouse. For 3 years, she'd lived in this town but had rarely ventured out, ashamed of the bruises Frank sometimes left, afraid of his anger if she talked to others too long. Now, looking at Valentine through new eyes, she wondered if she might find a place here after all. The meeting with Miss Thompson went better than Margaret dared hope. The schoolteacher, a sharp-eyed woman of about 40 with a no-nonsense manner but a kind smile, asked a few questions about Margaret's education, listened to her read a passage from a textbook, and had her solve some arithmetic problems. "You'll do nicely, Mrs. Phillips," she declared. "The children can be a handful, but they're good at heart. You can move into the boarding house tomorrow. Mrs. Wentworth keeps a decent table, and the other boarders are respectable folks, mostly the telegraph operator, the new bank clerk, and myself." "Thank you for this opportunity," Margaret said, meaning it more than she could express. A job, a roof over her head, a fresh start. It seemed almost too good to be true. Ethan walked her back to the hotel, looking pleased. "Told you Miss Thompson would take to you. I'm grateful to you both." "I never expected." She trailed off, emotion closing her throat. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Ethan said simply. He hesitated before adding, "I'd be pleased if you'd join me for supper this evening to celebrate your new position." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her the way Ethan did, as if she mattered. "I'd like that very much." Over the next weeks, Margaret settled into her new life with surprising ease. The schoolchildren accepted her without question, and she found she had a knack for explaining difficult concepts in ways they understood. Miss Thompson praised her patience and creativity. The room at the boarding house was small but clean, with a window that caught the morning sun. After years of living in Frank's perpetual mess and chaos, Margaret treasured the quiet order of her new space. And then there was Ethan. He made a point of walking her home from school most days, bringing her small gifts: a wildflower, a piece of ribbon, once a book of poetry. They took Sunday afternoon walks along the river, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret learned that Ethan had come west after the war, haunted by what he'd seen at Gettysburg. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a bounty hunter, and finally a lawman. Valentine was the first place that felt like home since he left Pennsylvania. In turn, she told him about growing up in Chicago, the daughter of a bookbinder. How she'd met Frank when he swept through town with tales of adventure and prosperity out west. How slowly, almost imperceptibly, the charming man she married had transformed into someone cruel and selfish. "I should have left earlier," she confessed one evening as they sat on a bench outside the church. "But he always apologized so convincingly, and where would I have gone?" A woman alone doesn't have many options. "You're not alone now," Ethan said, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. It was true, Margaret realized. In just a few short weeks, she'd built connections in Valentine. Miss Thompson had become a mentor and friend. Mrs. Wentworth fussed over her too thin frame and slipped extra portions onto her plate. Even some of the mothers of her students had begun including her in their quilting circle. And Ethan. With Ethan, she felt something awakening that she'd thought Frank had killed forever: hope, possibility, the dangerous flutter of attraction. In early December, as Valentine prepared for Christmas, word came that Frank had been arrested in Sioux City for cheating at cards. The telegram, addressed to Ethan, mentioned that Frank had boasted of having a wife in Valentine who would pay his bail. "What will you do?" Ethan asked after showing her the telegram. They were in his office at the jailhouse, the pot-bellied stove keeping the winter chill at bay. Margaret stared at the paper, Frank's name in stark black ink. Once it would have sent her into a panic. Now she felt only a distant sadness for the man she'd once loved. "Nothing," she said firmly. "I'm not his wife in any way that matters. Let Sioux City deal with him." Ethan studied her face. "He might come looking for you when he gets out. I know, but I won't live in fear of Frank Phillips anymore." She raised her chin. "If he comes, I'll face him, and this time I won't be alone." The pride in Ethan's eyes warmed her more than any fire could. Christmas Eve brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed Valentine in pristine white. The schoolhouse celebration was a joyful affair, with children performing recitations and carols, followed by hot cider and cookies baked by the town's mothers. Margaret wore her best dress, a dark green wool that Mrs. Wentworth had helped her alter from one of the boarding house owner's own gowns. When Ethan arrived to escort her home, his appreciative gaze made her cheeks flush. They walked slowly through the silent, snow-covered streets, their breaths clouding in the cold air. Lamplight spilled from windows, and the scent of pine and cinnamon wafted from open doors as they passed. "I have something for you," Ethan said as they reached the boarding house porch. He pulled a small package from his coat pocket, wrapped in brown paper and tied with red string. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to find a silver locket on a delicate chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny dried wildflower pressed inside the same type as the first one he'd given her. "It's beautiful," she whispered, deeply touched. "It was my mother's," Ethan said. "I've been saving it for someone special." He took her hands in his. "Margaret, these past months have been the happiest I can remember. I know it's soon, and I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, but I find myself thinking of you morning, noon, and night." Margaret's heart pounded. "Ethan." "I'm not asking for promises yet," he said quickly. "Just permission to court you properly, once your situation with Frank is resolved legally. To see if what I feel, what I hope we both feel, might grow into something lasting." Margaret looked up at this good, honorable man who had saved her in more ways than he knew. The answer was simple. "Yes," she said, smiling through sudden tears. "Yes." Ethan's face lit with joy. Gently, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss as light as the snowflakes falling around them, but filled with the promise of warmer days to come. January brought bitter cold and an unexpected visitor. Margaret was helping the younger children with their letters when the schoolhouse door banged open, letting in a blast of frigid air and Frank Phillips. He looked worse than when she'd last seen him, thinner, his face reddened by cold and drink, his clothes shabby. His eyes, though, still held that dangerous gleam she remembered all too well. "There you are, Maggie," he slurred, stumbling into the room. "Been looking everywhere for you." The children fell silent, sensing trouble. Miss Thompson moved swiftly to stand between them and the intruder. "Mr. Phillips, you are interrupting a school day," she said sharply. "If you wish to speak with Mrs. Phillips, you may wait outside until classes end." Frank ignored her, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Margaret. "Get your things, woman, we're going home." Margaret felt old fear rising but pushed it down. She was not the same frightened, broken woman he'd left behind. "This is my home now, Frank, and my name is Margaret, not Maggie. You should leave." His face darkened with anger. "Don't you talk back to me, you're my wife." "The wife you sold for whiskey," Margaret replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "I think that ended our arrangement." Frank lunged forward, but before he could reach her, the door opened again and Ethan stepped in, alerted by one of the older students who'd slipped out at the first sign of trouble. "That's far enough, Phillips," he said, hand resting on his holstered pistol. Frank whirled around. "This ain't your business, Sheriff. That's my property you're meddling with." "Mrs. Phillips is a citizen of this town under my protection," Ethan replied coldly. "And she's not property, she's a person who makes her own decisions. She's decided she doesn't want to go with you. She's my wife." "A wife you abandoned after attempting to sell her," Ethan pointed out. "I've spoken with Judge Harmon. Under Nebraska law, that constitutes abandonment and extreme cruelty. Grounds for divorce." Frank's face contorted with rage. "You turning my wife against me, you warming her bed now, Adams." Ethan remained unmoved. "You have two choices, Phillips. Leave Valentine peacefully and don't come back, or spend the night in my jail for disturbing the peace. Come morning, you'll leave anyway." For a tense moment, Margaret thought Frank might try something foolish. His hands curled into fists and he swayed slightly, alcohol and anger making a dangerous combination. Then, abruptly, he spat on the floor. "Keep the whore. She wasn't worth much anyway." Ethan moved so fast Margaret barely saw it. One moment he was by the door, the next he had Frank by the collar, pushing him against the wall. "Apologize to the lady," he growled, "or I'll forget I'm wearing this badge." Frank, suddenly sober enough to recognize the danger in Ethan's eyes, muttered an incoherent apology. Ethan dragged him outside, and through the window, Margaret saw him marching Frank down the street toward the jailhouse. Miss Thompson cleared her throat. "Children, page 37 in your readers, please. Practice quietly while I speak with Mrs. Phillips." She led Margaret to the small cloakroom. "Are you all right?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Yes, seeing him was difficult, but I'm not afraid anymore." "Good." Miss Thompson squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than you know, Margaret. Now shall we continue our lessons?" The children need stability, especially after such a disruption. Grateful for the normalcy, Margaret returned to the classroom, her back straight and her resolve firmer than ever. That evening, Ethan came to the boarding house. They sat in the parlor, the housekeeper discreetly busy in the next room to provide propriety. "Frank's gone," Ethan told her. "I put him on the eastbound stage with a warning not to return. He seemed eager enough to leave once he sobered up." "Thank you," Margaret said. "Not just for today, but for everything since that night behind the livery." Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You're the one who's rebuilt your life. I just provided a door. You walked through it on your own strength." Margaret smiled, touched by his understanding. "What happens now? With the divorce, I mean?" "Judge Harmon will be in Valentine next month for circuit court. He can hear your petition then. Given the circumstances, I don't think you'll have any trouble." The thought of being legally free from Frank lifted a weight Margaret hadn't realized she was still carrying. "And after that," Ethan reached for her hand. "After that, if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly, without shadows from the past hanging over us." "I'd like that very much," Margaret said, her heart full. Spring came to Valentine, bringing with it renewal and fresh beginnings. The divorce was granted in February, simpler than Margaret had feared. Frank didn't contest it, having apparently found easier prospects farther east. As the snow melted and crocuses peeked through the mud, Ethan began building a small house on a plot of land just outside town. Margaret spent her free afternoons helping, learning to hammer nails and sand floors alongside him. "It's not much," he apologized one day as they sat on the unfinished porch, sharing a lunch of bread and cheese. "2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small parlor, nothing fancy." "It's perfect," Margaret assured him, looking around at the half-built structure that represented so much more than just wood and nails. "A home should be measured by the love inside it, not its size." Ethan's smile was tender as he took her hand. "Margaret Zimmerman, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Of making this house a home with me?" Though she'd seen it coming, the question still made her heart skip. This was so different from Frank's whirlwind courtship, a solid foundation built on respect, friendship, and genuine care. "Yes," she said, laughing through happy tears. "Yes, I will." They married in May, with wildflowers adorning the church and the entire town turning out to celebrate. Miss Thompson was Margaret's matron of honor, and the town mayor stood up with Ethan. After the ceremony, there was a community dinner in the town square with every family contributing dishes. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit, Ethan led Margaret in the first dance. As they swayed together, he whispered in her ear, "I meant what I said that night, you know. You're worth more than gold, Margaret Adams." Margaret looked up at her husband, this man who had seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself. "And you, Ethan Adams, are worth more than all the stars in the sky." Later that night in their new home, they stood in the doorway of the second bedroom. "What do you think?" Ethan asked. "A nursery someday." Margaret leaned against him, picturing small feet running through the rooms, children's laughter filling the spaces. "I'd like that. A family of our own." "We already are a family," Ethan said, drawing her close. "Everything else is just a blessing added." 3 years to the day after Frank Phillips had sold his wife for whiskey, Margaret Adams stood on the porch of her home, watching her husband play with their 6-month-old son. Little James Ethan Adams squealed with delight as his father lifted him high into the air, his chubby legs kicking with excitement. The house had grown with their family, a back porch added last summer, flower beds Margaret had planted framing the walkway, a vegetable garden thriving behind the house. Ethan had been elected town mayor the previous fall, his fair-minded approach to justice earning him the respect of everyone in Valentine. Margaret still worked at the school 3 days a week, having found a true calling in teaching. The other days, she cared for James and helped organize the town's first proper library. "Mama's watching us, Jamie," Ethan called out, swinging the baby around again. "Should we show her how high you can fly?" Margaret laughed, descending the steps to join them in the yard. Ethan wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her into their circle of joy. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Adams," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Margaret looked up at him, this man who had shown her what love truly meant, not possession or control, but partnership and respect. "Happy anniversary, Mayor Adams." As the setting sun painted Valentine in shades of gold, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. From desperation to hope, from abandonment to belonging, from a woman traded for whiskey to one cherished beyond measure. Sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest futures, and sometimes a hand extended in kindness could change the course of a life forever. "I love you," she told Ethan, meaning it with every fiber of her being. His smile, warm and steady as the man himself, was all the answer she needed.